Currently, there have been a lot of ongoing discussions in the community about how Dead by Daylight is in the worst state it's ever been in terms of bugs, balance, and overall gameplay health. And while I agree that we're certainly in a rut, and the game, despite getting 3 huge licenses recently, botched 2 of them and did not give behavior the growth they thought they would get for the game from all of this hype. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. While DBD is definitely in a bad spot right now, I'll leave it to the others to talk about that. I'm not going to say be grateful that the game isn't in as bad of a spot as it was a few years ago, because the state of the game currently is still incredibly embarrassing, but I want to take attention away from that and educate the masses, giving you a quick history lesson that I briefly mentioned in this video a little bit ago. There is a time that Dead by Daylight had far worse balance than it does now, a much bigger problems with cheaters, DDoSing, and all sorts of shit, multiple terrible chapter releases in a row, skill-based matchmaking being introduced and being way too strict, turning every regular player's games into tournaments, and much, much more. And I would know, because as someone who started playing right after Pyramid Head's release, I played through a lot of this and eventually got fed up right about here, and many others did too. I would label this period as the time between A Binding of Kin's release on December 1st, 2020, until roughly the 6.1.0 patch on July 19th, 2022, and Project W a month or so later. So why was this particular period of the game so bad to me? Why did so many players leave? Well, let me tell you a story. Here's the worst period of DBD from my perspective and how I remember it. So before I get comments saying, well, the balance and exploits and stuff of older patches was way worse, man. Like, what about insta-heals? What about brand new parts and instant moris? You didn't have to deal with that stuff during this time, right? And what about the much older issues of the game, like dedicated servers? My rebuttal to this is that the game at that point hadn't really been fully optimized by players around that time, and gameplay like this was largely more acceptable considering how new the game was and the much smaller development team. Dead by Daylight wasn't really taken seriously around that time, and honestly around 2019 to 2020, the game seemed to mostly have things under control. They were releasing good chapters, the balance was okay for the most part, and while it was always known for bugs and cheaters, it wasn't necessarily as bad as it soon became. But soon enters A Binding of Kin, what's known by many as the buggiest Dead by Daylight has ever been. I remember playing this PTB, and the first match I ever had as twins, Victor got caught in the ground for the entire match and I couldn't use him. There have been multiple videos covering how twins were, and still are, one of the buggiest killers in Dead by Daylight, but at that time we'd seen nothing like it. Most likely because the idea of controlling 2 killers and the unique movement and mechanics of Victor was kind of unheard of when it came to DBD. It was a very creative idea, but the devs just couldn't make it work, and they had to shit it out to meet the release date. Victor couldn't even open lockers around this time, so you could just hide in there to avoid him no matter what. I remember around this time when the devs were even asking for the Labor of Love award on Steam, and the comments got so toxic that the thread had to just be locked entirely. Overall, this is probably the worst chapter launch we ever saw in the game, and it was the second one I ever saw. If only the player base realized things were about to get a lot worse. I don't just want to go over the chapters in a row, I want to talk about the overall state of the game here, but All Kill was, in my opinion and from my experience at the time, one of the worst chapters the game had ever seen, for its own reasons, but I'm not going to get into it. Afterwards was Resident Evil, and while it did do great things for the game, like helping DBD hit its peak concurrent player count, anyone who was there at the time remembers how bad it actually kinda was. While Nemesis was incredibly cool and unique, he was extremely weak, and RPD was and still is one of the most hated maps in the game. The main issue that people were running into around that time was the constant lag and stuttering on console that made the game essentially unplayable and killed any growth it could have had for a wider player base. But all of this seems minuscule compared to what was to come. I distinctly remember around the Pinhead chapter is when shit really hit the fan for this game. The previous chapters being kinda shit overall sort of eased us into the worst state of DBD, but we were right in the middle of it now, and this is when I remember taking an extended break from the game. First of all, the Hellraiser chapter. While Pinhead was an incredibly unique and well-integrated killer, who's still one of my personal favorites, everything that was happening around him at the time was awful. If you were there, you definitely remember the NFT fiasco, which is still one of the most embarrassing things Behavior has ever done, as well as Pinhead's voice lines being removed for months. That one really pissed people off for some reason. But the worst inclusion around this time was the skill-based matchmaking. The way matchmaking used to work in the game was the emblem system, which wasn't perfect, but basically calculated how much MMR you got based on how much you did in the match. There were some issues like playing Tombstone Myers, getting 4 kills, and still D-ranking since you didn't get enough chases or hooks, but overall it worked fine. But to push the game into a more modern state, the devs around this time introduced skill-based matchmaking, which everyone was complaining about, and rightfully so. This was like the main thing everyone was talking about in the community for like months. The idea of calculating your skill off kills versus escapes was never a good idea, and we still see traces of it to this day. The devs had this infamous livestream where they compared Dead by Daylight to hockey and said stuff like this.
Kills and escapes are proxies for skill, in that skilled play inherently leads to kills or escape. Think about sports, and I'll use hockey as an example because I'm Canadian. You wouldn't say they only count wins when placing teams in the standings, but they should also count shots on goal too. A more skilled player takes more shots. It's important to remember that shots lead to goals, which lead to win.
If you were there around that time, you definitely remember this. Skill-based matchmaking initially was just far too strict, and high MMR was actually a thing for once in this game. Unlike now, where high MMR is about half the player base in a melting pot of mediocre players who play once a week and compies who play 10 hours a day. You especially felt it on Killer, where every survivor was just running the same bullshit every match, and Killer in general at that time was just far weaker before the 6.1.0 changes, so it just encouraged you to AFK on Blight and not even try variety. Every survivor around this time was running a build that looked like this, and you could say the same nowadays, but you simply do not understand how impactful these perks were. Dead Hard was every Killer player's most hated perk around this time, and for good reason. You think it's annoying now, or even pre-nerf where you didn't have to be hooked? You don't know the horrors. Dead Hard around this period I'm talking about, especially after skill-based matchmaking, was the worst, most brain-dead, overpowered thing that survivors have ever had in the modern landscape of Dead by Daylight. You saw it every game, on every survivor. They could use it for distance, they could use it to line up saves, they could even dodge hits, dodge any killer ability. Just watch this video by Kill a Whale and witness the true horrors for yourself. This one perk made Killer in general far, far harder, and not in a fulfilling way. And you might be saying, well, Dead Hard has always been in the game, right? As well as many other broken things. What made it so bad around this time? First of all, the game at this point was pretty optimized. Before 2018 at least, nobody really knew what they were doing. Most survivors just hid or ran in a straight line when they were caught. And when Dead Hard was added back in the day, people used it for a bit, but it was often seen as a much weaker sprint burst or balanced landing due to the hiding playstyle, you getting far less distance, and the fact that exhaustion cooldown recharged while running, making sprint burst the obvious choice. And two, skill-based matchmaking turned basically every match into a tournament. Survivors would see nothing but blights every match, and killers would just see the same brain-dead meta bullshit in 4-man swifts. And no, this wasn't really negativity bias talking. The game around this time was simply just far more survivor-sided than it is now. With Dead Hard being in the game and so many killers being far weaker than they are now, it honestly just felt like your skill wasn't really rewarded at all, so just tunnel and play Blight, right? If you think Blight is prevalent now, he had completely taken over the game at this point, and you'd see one basically every match, especially because the meta around that time was even better towards higher mobility killers who could pressure the map. If most survivor builds look like this, then most killer builds look like this. No one really seems to talk about how prevalent Tinkerer was back then. But yeah, with Ruin plus Undying constantly regressing gens, and requiring survivors to sometimes cleanse Ruin 4 times to remove it, Tinkerer would just activate on generators over and over again, allowing faster killers like Blight to easily patrol them no matter the distance. And honestly, it just seemed like every killer you went against wanted to AFK on Blight with his brain-dead pre-nerf add-ons and pre-patch exploits, because the sentiment around this time was that Blight was one of the most well-designed killers in the game, and you'd get crucified for saying that he wasn't even to this day, despite him being in a much more ridiculous state back then than he is now, and he's still brain-dead now. If you think seeing Blights all the time is bad now, nowadays we have Blight, but we also have Blight 2, Diet Blight, Balanced Blight, Blight Plus, and we even had Short Blight for a while before he was taken out back and shot. As well as the MMR being in a much looser state nowadays, you see more killer variety nowadays than you ever have in the game, with these extremely popular killers that all fill the dash niche. With skill-based matchmaking basically turning every match into a tournament, you can see what it did to these Twitchies' mental health in some of the videos at the time. Survivors were always using Dead Hard, as well as Decisive Strike and Unbreakable, which led to extremely cheesy and uncounterable tactics.
The DS Unbreakable meta. This is a meta I have a personal hatred for, due to just how long this meta was around, with it spanning years of time. It was quite possibly in fact one of the longest surviving survivor metas of DBD history. It paired together Decisive Strike and Unbreakable, with both perks being misused. DS is designed to be an anti-tunnel perk, and Unbreakable an anti-slugging perk, but during this meta they were used instead for aggression. DS didn't deactivate back then when on a generator, unhooking, breaking and whatever else, meaning you could run around freely and do things right in front of the killer, and they could do nothing. If they picked you up, you DS them. If they slugged you, you used Unbreakable.
This build back in the day was called the small PP build, and I remember everyone complaining about it. Stretched res at the time was also a huge issue, with pretty much every sweaty survivor one trick using it, allowing them to look over walls and around corners further than ever intended. And this wasn't considered cheating, it was kinda normalized actually. It wasn't much better playing Survivor either though, especially in solo queue. Killers basically had to run Ruin Undying Tinkerer every match, which was basically RNG because everything else you could run kinda sucked. The game having so many balance issues around this game, the worst balance we've ever seen in modern day Dead by Daylight, led to outcry. But despite tons of large content creators voicing their complaints with the state of the game in many ways, it felt like the devs just did not listen to feedback in the slightest. The fact that it took 5 fucking years for Dead Hard to be nerfed, at least 2 of those years it was in full force, and you'd see it on at least 2 survivors every game, is unbelievable and kind of inexcusable for how much that singular perk ruined the game for so long. Afterwards, other incredibly problematic perks like Eruption and Made for This were nerfed within months, which is still incredibly long and kind of embarrassing it took that long, but hey, at least we're getting somewhere, right? I also remember some of the stupidest and most unnecessary nerfs to C-tier killers around this time, like Wraith and Deathslinger, while leaving Nurse and Blight untouched, but we still get that to this day. I just remember the frustration of seeing stuff like Buffed Freddy become one of the worst killers for years because people cried, and Wraith getting his lunge nerf, but pretty much none of the problematic survivor shit got touched in the slightest. Around this time, Circle of Healing was introduced into the game, and if you were there, you remember how game-breaking that shit was. It basically made hit and run impossible. Balance wasn't only the huge issue going on around this time though, although it's what I remember the most because it was magnified by the incredibly strict skill-based matchmaking. You might occasionally run into cheaters now, and cheaters as of late have kind of been seeing a bit of a resurgence, but holy shit, during this period it was like every other match. Some of the biggest streamers basically couldn't even play the game during this time because cheaters would come in, hold the game hostage, and essentially either force them to disconnect, incurring a penalty, or wait a full 2 hours for the server to eventually close. This was around the time cheaters really started realizing how bad DBD's anti-cheat was, and honestly still kind of is, and took full advantage of that. You could not avoid them, you had to be there. And other insidious things were also going on around the time too, and telling the devs about it felt like you were talking to a brick wall. I recall around the time Portrait of a Murder came out, many players and streamers were DDoSed and some even swatted, and people initially thought it was because of the PTB, but it kept happening afterwards time after time on live servers, and this went on for like months until the devs finally decided to step in and do something in like March or something. This was so long after these attacks. The security update seemed to be mostly effective for the time. We still hear stuff about this happening to this day, but around this time it was easily worse than it had ever been. In general, around this time, nobody really wanted to play Killer, which is the exact opposite of how it is now. The Killer queue times are basically instant, but the Survivor queue times could take like 10 minutes, because who wants to queue up and be forced to tunnel versus 4 dead hards in a subtle cheater moving 4% faster? There was nothing really fun about it. There were basically no new innovations in the game around this time either, no exciting balance, no interesting killers, no fun new modifiers or game modes, just depressing stagnation and complacency. While some of the killers released around this time have become favorites of mine, I saw a similar trend in killers that made each one kind of samey to play against. Every killer released around this time felt like they were a mid-range zoning killer who could either scare you into dodging with their power by faking it or just hit you when your animation locked. Before this period, we got Demogorgon, Deathslinger, and Pyramid Head all nearly back to back, who each have zoning powers with similar counterplay. Then we got Twins directly into Trickster, directly into Nemesis, directly into Pinhead, directly into Artist. We basically got 4 to 5 killers in a row that had similar range zoning attacks, and it was getting old. I know killers like Pinhead, Artist, Nemesis, they're all capable of way more than that, but at the time this is what it felt like. The thing is, most of these were just fairly weak though, at least for the time. And getting Sadako and Dredge afterwards, 2 incredibly weak killers, versus the modern landscape of Dead by Daylight with every survivor running 4 crutch perks and sending you to Old Eyrie of Crows, was just unplayable. Reminder, around this time they actually buffed Dead Hard, which is like the best survivor perk in the game. They buffed it by adding hit validation. Like, it was a whole thing. This pissed me off so much. This happened because survivors cried about being exhausted on the ground when using Dead Hard, which was like its only weakness, that it was a little bit inconsistent. So to fix this, they just made it basically impossible to miss it. It would be like if they buffed Pain Resonance nowadays by making every hook a Scourge hook. Thankfully, we reached the end in the 6.1.0 mid chapter where it felt like the devs were finally listening to the feedback, nerfing a ton of broken things on both sides, buffing Killer as a whole, and even doing long requested things I didn't expect like base kit borrowed time, and the prestige system rework, which have shown to be incredibly healthy for the game. I stopped playing regularly around Trickster's release, only coming back for a little bit to see how the game was going, and keeping up with it online, but after this patch, I basically came back and haven't stopped playing it all since. It's been about 3 years since 6.1.0, and where are we now? Well, not in the best state, state, clearly, but just a reminder, it could be a lot worse. The matchmaking has massively improved, and while not perfect, does lead to a lot more fun and fair matches without restricting itself too much. The balance is doing all right, most killers are at least playable versus most decent teams, and the cheaters and DDoS attacks have been far more scarce. It's definitely not perfect, it's far from it, but just be glad you don't have to hit all 4 survivors 3 times every chase with old Dead Hard, or have to wait in 20-minute survivor queue times, while these flannel neckbeard hipsters who drink craft beer from years ago laugh at your suggestions, because they're the experts who flunked out of college to do game development. There are a few other miscellaneous things that happened around this time that really pissed me off. There was a new HUD and survivor animations released around this time to sort of try to modernize the game a lot more, and while overall I think they were great changes that stood the test of time, on release they were awful. Remember how janky the animations were during this period? Or how shit the HUD looked? Everyone was saying it looked like a mobile game HUD. The chat filter was released too, which is still a horrifically bad change, and barely works, and I have no idea why they even bothered. Stranger Things was removed at this time too, and I know behavior doesn't really have control over that, but it still stung when their game really needed a win, and we got one of the most beloved chapters removed for years. Right around the middle of this time, despite the game being in what I and many others believe is the worst state ever, the devs released Hooked on You, which made me so irrationally angry. They weren't working on nerfing Dead Hard, they weren't working on fixing DDoSing or cheating or lag switching, which again were huge issues at the time. They weren't focusing on fixing the awful matchmaking, they were making this. It would have been a mildly funny practical joke if the game was in a decent state, but right after this, I had basically seen enough. Like, this is what they were doing? Around this time, Video Horror Society came out, and right after it came out, Behavior conveniently did a blood hunt for the first time in like a year to try to get people to stay, but a lot of people were kind of jumping ship because VHS came out at the perfect time and offered something similar to DVD, but a super fresh concept with its own incredibly unique mechanics. That game eventually flopped after having a lot of its own issues, some of which were kind of funnily enough similar to the issues DVD had at its worst state, but like I said, after the 6.1.0 patch, I came back and I'm here to stay because regardless of the poor decisions the devs make from time to time, I know it could never get as bad as it did back then, and if this right now is the worst state the game has been in for a while, where the game is mostly still playable and the balance is fine and the killer variety is fine and the events are all fine, everything's just kinda the main issue being the bugs, which are gonna get patched eventually, then I'm hopeful that when we get out of this rut, we'll get back on track. I am still a little worried about this, but we'll cross that bridge when we come to it.